"This is what happens when you disobey me," my father said, standing beside a barrel fire fueled by everything I owned, a garden hose in his hand to keep the flames from touching his precious lawn. My clothes, my sketchbooks, my grandmother's handmade quilt, 3 winters of careful stitching, disappeared in less than 4 minutes. I was 17. I stood there watching the smoke drift into the sky and said nothing. 6 years later, I called him. He answered on the first ring. I spoke only 2 words. What he discovered in his mailbox that evening would change everything, though not in the way he imagined. Before we begin the story, feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there in the comments. I'm always curious to see how far these stories travel. Your support really motivates me to keep sharing stories like this. My name is Harper Collins. I'm 23 now. Let me take you back to Columbus, Ohio, to the fall when I was 17, the week my father found out I had applied to college. The house at 2714 Maplewood Drive was a 3-bedroom ranch sitting on a quarter-acre lot in a quiet suburb where American flag stickers decorated half the mailboxes and pickup trucks filled most of the driveways. My father, Anthony Collins, had reshingled the roof himself, poured the backyard patio with his own hands, and mounted a polished brass plaque with our house numbers beside the front door. Every spring he buffed those numbers until they shone like a medal. To him, the house wasn't just a place to live. It was evidence. Evidence he had built something. Evidence he mattered. Evidence he was the one in control. And inside that house, he absolutely was. Dinner happened at exactly 6. I cooked, I cleaned. My older brother Dylan sat down, ate, and left his plate where it was, because that was simply how things worked in our house. My father took the chair at the head of the table, remote control in hand, deciding what played on the television. If the meal came out late, or the chicken turned out dry, the silence that followed grew heavy enough to make your chest tighten. Anthony kept every important document locked inside a steel filing cabinet in the garage: my birth certificate, my social security card, my medical records. I had never even held my own identification. When I once needed my social security number to apply for a part-time job at a coffee shop, he wrote the 9 digits on a sticky note, watched me memorize them, then peeled the note away and locked it back up. In the living room sat his lazy-boy recliner, dark oxblood leather worn at the arms. No one else was allowed to sit there. No one touched it. The chair faced the television like a throne facing its court, and every evening Anthony lowered himself into it with the calm certainty of a man who believed the entire house revolved around his comfort. And in many ways, it did. My brother Dylan was 22 when I was 17. My father had paid for his community college tuition. Nearly 2 years of classes Dylan mostly skipped before eventually dropping out, without ever asking for gratitude. Now Anthony was making plans to open an auto repair shop for him in the Franklinton industrial area. Weekends were spent comparing hydraulic lifts and floor jacks, the way some families compared vacation destinations. Meanwhile, I graduated near the top of my class. My art teacher, Caroline Whitaker, hung one of my charcoal portraits in the hallway display case at school. My math scores were strong enough that the guidance counselor printed a list of colleges and slid it across her desk toward me with quiet encouragement. I folded the paper carefully and carried it home inside my textbook. After dinner one night, once the dishes were cleared, I placed that list on the table in front of my father. He didn't even touch it. "College," he said flatly. Not a question. "For what?" "Business," I replied. "Or accounting." He leaned back in his chair. "A girl goes to college, gets a degree, then gets married and lets that degree sit in a drawer. You want to bury yourself in $50,000 of debt for a piece of paper you'll never use?" My mother, Jessica Collins, stood at the sink with her hands resting on a plate. She didn't turn around. "I could apply for financial aid," I said quietly. "You could get a job and contribute to this household," he answered. "That's what you're supposed to do." I already had a job. On weekends I worked at a small coffee shop, earning $8.75 an hour. Every paycheck went straight into a joint account my father had opened in both our names. I never saw statements. I didn't have an ATM card. My work went in, and he decided where the money went afterward. Dylan's future was treated like an investment. Mine was treated like an expense. But every Tuesday and Thursday after school, I stayed at the library. My father believed I was volunteering, shelving books to earn community service credit. I wasn't. When I was 14, Anthony slammed his palm onto the dinner table so hard the water glasses jumped. I don't even remember what started it. Maybe I spoke without being asked. Maybe I breathed too loudly. Maybe my existence reminded him he wasn't the only person in the room. He leaned across the table and shouted inches from my face until his spit hit my cheek. The next morning, I told my school counselor. 4 days later, a woman from Child Protective Services knocked on our door. She wore a lanyard and carried a patient smile. She walked through the house, clean kitchen, full refrigerator, no visible bruises, took notes, and asked questions. My father stayed calm the entire time, polite and composed in the way men become when they know exactly what's at stake. Nothing came from the visit, but Anthony Collins never forgot it. From that moment on, I became the daughter who called the cops on her own father. He made sure every aunt, uncle, and cousin heard the story. Thanksgiving dinners, Easter brunches, 4th of July cookouts. He brought it up again and again, reopening the wound like a man picking at a scab. Harper once brought CPS into our house, he would say with a laugh. 14 years old. Can you imagine that? I put a roof over her head, and she repaid me with a caseworker in my living room. Relatives slowly stopped reaching out. Invitations grew rare. I became the difficult one, the problem child, the example whispered about when people talked about daughters who forgot their place. And whenever I pushed back about anything, curfews, chores, the money my father controlled, he had one sentence that ended the discussion every time. You want to call the cops again? Go ahead. Let's see who believes you now. One evening in the kitchen, when it was just the two of us, my mother leaned close and whispered, "Don't provoke him, Harper." Her hands trembled around a mug of coffee. She wasn't defending him, she was surviving him. Somewhere in the quiet calculations she made every day, keeping me silent felt like the only way to keep both of us safe. On the living room wall hung a framed family portrait from a department store studio. Anthony, Jessica, and Dylan Collins were all smiling beneath bright lights. I wasn't in the picture. When relatives asked why, my father told them I'd been busy that day. The truth was much simpler. He never invited me. My grandmother, my mother's mother, died the spring I turned 15. Ovarian cancer, caught too late. During her final months, she stayed at home in a recliner that looked nothing like my father's, surrounded by baskets of fabric and a sewing machine that hummed late into the night. The quilt she left me was made from scraps of cotton clothing we had both worn over the years. A sleeve from my 4th grade field trip shirt, the hem of the dress she wore to my kindergarten ceremony, pieces of old flannel pajamas and faded blouses stitched together into something warm in a way only handmade things can be. She tucked small lavender sachets into the seams. Even 2 years after she passed away, the scent was still there. Every night I pulled that quilt up to my chin, and for a few quiet seconds, I felt like I belonged to someone who was happy I existed. My grandmother was also the only adult who ever told me directly, "You're good with numbers, Harper. You need to go to college. Promise me you will." I promised. So on those Tuesday and Thursday afternoons when my father thought I was shelving books for volunteer credit, I was actually sitting at a library computer. I opened the admissions page for Columbus State Community College, filling out the application one section at a time. I saved my progress carefully, erased the browser history before logging off, and used the school's mailing address so no letters would arrive at home. I listed Caroline Whitaker as a reference and wrote my personal essay about the quilt, about how something beautiful could be built from scraps, about patience as a quiet form of love. I told no one. What I didn't know was that after the CPS visit, my father had demanded parental monitoring on the school network system. Each week, the system flagged certain online activities and automatically sent an email summary to the parent on file. The week I opened college admission pages 4 different times, Anthony Collins received that alert. When I came home that Thursday evening, I knew something was wrong before I even stepped into the kitchen. The television was off. My father sat in his recliner, but he wasn't leaning back. He sat upright, both feet flat on the floor, his hands resting heavily on the armrests like a judge preparing to announce a verdict. The silence inside the house felt unnatural, heavy and compressed, the kind that makes your ears ring. "Sit down," he said. I sat on the couch across from him. My backpack was still on my shoulders, the zipper pressing against my spine. "I got an email from the school," he said calmly. His voice was quiet and controlled, which was far worse than yelling. Yelling meant the storm had already broken. This tone meant it was still building. "College application resources. 4 visits this week. Want to explain that?" My throat went dry. "I was just looking into—" "Behind my back," he interrupted, his voice never rising. "You sat in that library and applied to college behind my back after I told you no, after I explained exactly why. I just wanted to see if it was possible. You sneaked around the same way you did when you were 14. He let the reference to CPS hang in the air. It always landed exactly where he wanted it. "You call authorities on your own father, then you go behind my back to do the one thing I told you we couldn't afford. Same pattern, sneaking, lying." My mother stood at the sink. I could hear the faucet still running even though she had stopped washing anything. Her hands remained motionless in the water. My father rose from the chair. The recliner rocked slightly behind him. He walked toward the garage, and I heard the steel filing cabinet open, followed by the jingle of keys. When he returned, he carried a heavy black trash bag and his keyring. He looked straight at me and spoke a single word: "Outside." But first he went upstairs to my room. I followed him because I didn't know what else to do. My body still hadn't caught up with what was happening. He opened my closet and began pulling everything down. Shirts, jeans, the winter coat I had bought secondhand with tips from the coffee shop. He shoved them into the trash bag the way someone gathers leaves in autumn. Quick, methodical, no hesitation. Then he grabbed my sketchbooks. 3 years of charcoal drawings, portraits, still lifes, including the piece Mrs. Whitaker had displayed at school. He folded them sharply in half to make them fit inside the bag. Next came my books, Algebra 2, AP English, and a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice I had bought at a yard sale for 50 cents. Dylan stood in the hallway with his arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe. He watched like someone observing a traffic accident, curious, distant. He didn't say a word. He didn't step forward or try to stop anything. He simply watched his sister's life disappear into a garbage bag before glancing down at his phone. My mother appeared behind him. Her face had gone pale. "Anthony, please." "Shut your mouth," he snapped without turning around. "Or you're next." Jessica stepped back against the wall, one hand covering her lips. Then my father pulled the quilt from my bed. A sharp electric panic shot through my chest. "Not that," I said. My voice cracked. It was the first time I had raised it that night. "Please, that was Grandma's." He held the quilt in both hands, studying it the way someone studies an object they're about to use to make a point. "Your grandmother spoiled you," he said coldly. "Look where that got us." He carried the bag downstairs, through the kitchen, and out the back door. I followed him, and the moment I stepped into the yard, I saw the burn barrel already standing in the center of the grass. The same old steel drum he used every spring to burn yard waste was waiting there, positioned like it had been prepared hours earlier. That's when I understood. This wasn't anger in the moment. He had planned it. The barrel was already set. Anthony Collins flipped the trash bag upside down, dumping everything into the drum. My clothes, my books, my sketchbooks tumbled in like they meant nothing at all. Then he reached for a bottle of lighter fluid sitting on the patio table. He had placed that there too. He soaked everything. The sharp chemical smell cut through the cold October air. Then he pulled a long lighter from his pocket, flicked it once, and held the flame to the edge of a cotton shirt. The fire caught instantly. I stood about 6 feet away and watched 17 years of my life curl and blacken inside that steel barrel in my father's backyard. Sketchbook pages shriveled into ash. Fabric tightened and split as flames climbed higher. The lighter fluid made the fire leap so high I could feel the heat against my arms. Then he dropped the quilt in. Patchwork cotton. My grandmother's careful squares. lavender sachets sewn into the seams, soft flannel from nightgowns I had worn when I was 7, 10, 12. One corner caught fire first, then the flame spread inward. The colors darkened, twisted, and disappeared. In less than 4 minutes, it was gone. My father stood there holding a garden hose in his other hand, not for the things he was burning, but for the grass around the barrel in case sparks drifted too far. Next door, I noticed Eleanor Price standing on her back porch. She was in her 70s, white-haired, her hands pressed over her mouth as she watched through the chain-link fence. She didn't turn away. My father finally looked at me and raised his voice so the entire street could hear. "This is what happens when you disobey me." I stared at the smoke rising above the rooftops, a thin gray line dissolving into a bright blue sky that didn't seem to care about anything happening beneath it. I said nothing. Not because I had nothing to say, but because, in that moment, I had already spoken my final word in that house. He thought he was teaching me a lesson. He was right, just not the lesson he believed. That night I lay on a bare mattress in a room that smelled like lighter fluid and smoke. The quilt was gone. My sketchbooks were gone. Even my winter coat had disappeared from the closet. My father had locked the front door at 9, as he always did. The deadbolt he installed required a key from both sides. No one left that house without his permission. Around 11, my bedroom door opened. No knock, no light. My mother, Jessica Collins, slipped inside and sat carefully on the edge of the mattress. She stayed quiet for a moment. I could hear her breathing, soft and controlled, the way someone breathes when they've spent years trying not to make noise in a house that punishes it. She pressed a white envelope into my hand. I opened it using the faint glow from the streetlight coming through the blinds. Inside were my birth certificate, my social security documents, and a thin fold of cash. $500. Bills in 20s and 10s. Money she had quietly skimmed from grocery budgets over months, maybe years. Hidden in places my father would never check because he never went near grocery shopping. "Go," she whispered. "Don't come back. I'm sorry, Harper." She squeezed my hand once. Then she stood and left the room without looking back. If she had turned around, she would have cried. And if she cried, my father would have heard. And if he heard, that envelope would have vanished back into the filing cabinet and this small chance would disappear forever. I waited 15 minutes. Then I opened my bedroom window. Luckily, it was ground level. I swung my legs over the sill and dropped into the side yard below. I was wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and sneakers. Nothing else. I walked straight to Eleanor Price's house. 3 minutes. Her porch light was already on. I knocked twice. She opened the door, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside without asking a single question. That night I left 2714 Maplewood Drive with $500 and a white envelope. I had no idea that 6 years later I would stand in front of that same house holding a deed with my own name printed on it. My father realized I was gone the next morning at 6:15 when no one was in the kitchen making breakfast. He didn't search for me. Instead, he started calling relatives, every aunt, uncle, and cousin connected to the Collins family, and he told them a story so polished it sounded rehearsed. "She ran off in the middle of the night," he said. "No note, no explanation. After everything I've done for her. Food, clothes, a roof over her head. Some kids are just born ungrateful. Remember the CPS situation? Same girl, same pattern." The story spread quickly because he had spent years preparing the ground for it. Relatives who had already labeled me difficult upgraded the description to lost cause. No one called me. No one asked my mother what had actually happened. No one drove around looking for a 17-year-old girl who had walked out into an October night without a coat. By the afternoon, my father had already emptied my bedroom. Later, Eleanor told me she watched him carry out my bookshelf, my desk, and a floor lamp through her kitchen window. Within 48 hours, the room held a weight bench, a standing mirror, and rubber flooring. Dylan's new home gym. 17 years of my life erased in a single weekend. My father also called the school and reported that I had moved to live with relatives. The office secretary logged the information without asking questions. My guidance counselor, the one who had handed me the list of colleges, never even had the chance to wonder where I had gone. The next morning, Eleanor sat me at her kitchen table and pushed a plate of scrambled eggs toward me. "Eat first," she said gently. "Then we'll figure out the next step." She opened an old phone book, found the number for a youth shelter, and drove me there herself in her Buick. She didn't cry until she had already pulled away from the curb. That shelter became my new address. A bunk bed, bright fluorescent lights, a strict 10 p.m. curfew. 3 other girls in the room, each carrying their own version of a broken story. The place smelled like industrial cleaning spray and microwave popcorn. The mattresses were covered in vinyl. The showers ran lukewarm water for exactly 7 minutes before an automatic timer shut them off. At the shelter, I shared a small room with 3 other girls. One was Danielle, who slept with her shoes still on, as if she might need to leave at any moment. Another was Mackenzie, who talked in her sleep about someone named Kyle. The third girl went by Bertie. No one ever learned her real name. She stayed 2 weeks, then disappeared one morning without saying goodbye. A social worker named Nathan Alvarez helped me do something I had never done before in my life: open a bank account in my own name. I sat across from a teller at a Chase branch and slid my birth certificate and social security card across the counter, the same documents my mother had slipped into my hand in the dark. When the teller asked for the first deposit, I placed $200 from the $500 Jessica had given me into the account and kept the rest in cash for bus fare and food. Nathan also enrolled me in GED preparation classes, since I had left school before finishing my junior year. He helped me apply for Medicaid, which meant I could finally refill the inhaler I had needed since childhood but rarely had. My father believed asthma was mostly in your head. Within a week, I found work. Night shift cashier at a gas station convenience store, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I stood behind a bulletproof glass partition scanning energy drinks and lottery tickets while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. When the shift ended, I walked back to the shelter in the pale gray light just before sunrise. I carried the envelope my mother gave me in the inside pocket of my jacket every day. Not because of the money. Most of that disappeared quickly. I kept it because it proved she had tried. It proved she loved me the only way she could inside my father's house. The first thing I bought with money I earned myself was a pair of sneakers from a clearance rack at Walmart. $12. White with a thin blue stripe. I laced them up right there in the parking lot and stood on the asphalt. For the first time in months, it felt like I was standing on ground that actually belonged to me. Have you ever had a moment like that? Something small, something cheap, that suddenly made you feel like you were finally allowed to exist? At night, I lay on that narrow bunk in the shelter and asked myself questions that had no clear answers. Why did wanting an education count as disobedience? Why did ambition feel like betrayal in my father's house? If you grew up somewhere where your dreams were treated like disrespect, then you already understand. 6 months later, I passed my GED. My math score landed in the 92nd percentile. My grandmother would have been proud. When I turned 18, I enrolled at Columbus State Community College, the very school I had been secretly applying to when my father discovered everything. The irony sat heavy in my chest. Financial aid covered most of the tuition, and the rest I paid with the money from the gas station job. I moved out of the shelter and into a small apartment with 2 other students. It was technically a 1-bedroom, so we rotated sleeping schedules depending on who had night classes. My major was business administration. I chose it because my grandmother always said I was good with numbers. But there was another reason too. Somewhere along the way, I began to understand something I couldn't yet fully explain. Money was the structure beneath everything my father used to control our lives. If I wanted freedom, I needed to understand that system. Hundreds of miles of highway and a different phone area code separated me from 2714 Maplewood Drive. But small towns have a way of sending their stories after you. One afternoon, a cousin I hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years sent me a message on Facebook. "Your dad took out a loan on the house. Something about Dylan's shop." I checked the public records, Franklin County Recorder's Office. The documents showed my father had opened a home equity line of credit for $92,000, secured against the house. The money appeared the same month a new business was registered with the state, Collins Family Auto Works. And son, not daughter, not family. One afternoon, my bus route to campus passed through the Franklinton industrial area, and there it was, a bright new sign bolted to the front of a building. Collins Family Auto Works. Blue background, yellow block letters. My father had leased the building with money borrowed against the only real asset he owned, $92,000 for my brother's dream. $500 was all my mother could give me for mine. The year I turned 20, I almost gave up. I was working 2 jobs while taking 15 credit hours of classes. Night shift at the convenience store and weekend housekeeping at a Hampton Inn in downtown Columbus. My alarm rang at 5:30 every morning, and some nights I didn't fall asleep until after 1. My diet consisted mostly of ramen noodles, peanut butter sandwiches, and leftover breakfast pastries the hotel staff was allowed to take home. I nearly failed accounting 201. Not because the material was too hard, but because I fell asleep during the midterm exam. Literally asleep. Pen still in my hand, my face on the desk. When I woke up, there were 20 minutes left and half the test unanswered. Then another message arrived from a cousin, a screenshot. My father had posted something on Facebook. I wasn't connected to him there, but family networks have a way of carrying everything. His post read, "Sad to say my daughter chose the streets over family. I tried my best. Some people don't want help. Pray for her." Below it were 11 comments, relatives offering sympathy. One aunt wrote, "You did everything you could, Anthony. She'll learn the hard way. No one asked me, no one checked." That night, after finishing my housekeeping shift, I sat on the bus heading back to my apartment around 11 p.m. My forehead rested against the cold window as the city lights blurred past. For the first time since the fire in the backyard, I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears slipping into the collar of my work uniform, which smelled like bleach in someone else's hotel room. For about 10 minutes, I sat there wondering if Anthony Collins had been right all along. Maybe I was wasting my time. Maybe the world really was just a series of locked rooms controlled by men like him, and no matter how hard I tried, I would never find one that belonged to me. Then I remembered my grandmother's hands, the quilt, the careful stitching that had taken 3 winters to complete. "You're good with numbers, Harper. You have to go to school." I wiped my face with the sleeve of my jacket, stepped off the bus at my stop, and walked home. The next morning, I retook the exam. And I passed. I finished my associate's degree the semester I turned 21. There was no ceremony, no applause, just a diploma tucked into a thin cardboard folder and the quiet understanding that every credit on that transcript had been earned the hard way. That degree led to my first real job at Midwest Title Services, a small title company on East 5th Street in Columbus. Entry-level pay, $15 an hour. My work was to organize closing files, verify property records, and run title searches. It was the invisible paperwork behind nearly every real estate transaction in the city. Every day I handled stacks of deeds, lien releases, mortgage assignments, and foreclosure filings. Over time, I learned to read those documents the way a mechanic reads engine diagnostics, quickly, precisely, scanning for the one detail that didn't belong. The office itself was modest, 4 desks, a copier that jammed twice a week, and fluorescent lights that buzzed with a sound only I seemed to notice. But it was still mine, my desk, my name printed on the mailbox, my paychecks deposited into a bank account that no one else could touch. Next door worked a broker named Rachel Davenport. She was in her mid-40s, with silver streaks running through her dark hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She had a habit of swinging those glasses in small circles when she was thinking. She first noticed me because I was always the last person still working in the building. One evening she leaned through my office doorway. "You're still here," she said. "I like reading the filings," I replied. And that was the truth. She studied me over the top of her glasses. "You're sharper than half the agents in this building. Why aren't you licensed? Working on it, I said. That wasn't true yet, but it became true the moment she said it. Rachel began mentoring me, coffee meetings, lunch breaks, evenings spent studying comparative market analyses. She taught me how to read neighborhoods, how to calculate equity, how to recognize a distressed property long before it appeared on courthouse auction lists. One afternoon, she told me something I never forgot. In real estate, paper is power. Whoever holds the deed controls the truth. I wrote those words on a yellow sticky note and taped it to my desk. It stayed there for 2 years. 3 weeks after my 22nd birthday, I passed the Ohio real estate licensing exam on my first attempt. That same afternoon, Rachel offered me a job as a junior agent at Davenport Realty Group. Now my income came from commission. At first it wasn't much, but it was enough to move into a small studio apartment where I didn't have to share a room or sleep in shifts. It was also enough that every Sunday morning I opened my banking app and stared at the savings account slowly growing inside it with something close to disbelief. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles and several years of hard work separated me from 2714 Maplewood Drive. But real estate has a way of circling back. Through my work at Midwest Title Services, I had access to the same county property databases I used daily. I wasn't searching for my father. I didn't have to. When you work in real estate, information about every lien, mortgage, foreclosure, and property transfer eventually passes across your desk. And eventually, the information about my father did too. What those records revealed was simple. Collins Family Auto Works was losing money. My brother Dylan had hired too many employees, spent heavily on renovations no one asked for, and quietly pulled money from the business account for personal expenses, things like a leased Dodge Charger and weekend trips to Put-in-Bay with his girlfriend. The shop had been open less than 2 years and was already operating in the red. My father's response wasn't to confront him. Instead, he doubled down. He refinanced the house, rolling the original mortgage together with the $92,000 home equity line of credit into a new loan that pushed his total debt beyond the property's value. On paper, the house was dangerously close to being underwater. But in his mind, he was protecting the family legacy. One evening, after finishing a property showing, I drove past the Franklinton industrial area where the garage was located. The illuminated sign for Collins Family Auto Works still glowed above the building, but several LED bulbs had burned out. The missing lights made the sign read something closer to C. Lynn's Fam. Lee O.O. Works. It looked almost accidental, like something a novelist might invent for symbolism. But it was real. And I saw it. And I kept driving. The phone call came on a Sunday morning, about 6 months before everything changed. I didn't recognize the number and almost ignored it. I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing property comparables for a listing appointment. But something made me answer. Harper. I hadn't heard my mother's voice in 4 years. It sounded thinner than I remembered, stretched tight like a wire carrying too much tension. Mom? I'm calling from Eleanor's phone, Eleanor Price's. Of course I don't have one your father can't check. She gave me your number a long time ago. I didn't know if you'd answer. I answered. There was a pause. Then she said quietly, Your father's under a lot of pressure right now. The shop isn't doing well. He's drinking more. Dylan barely comes around anymore. She wasn't asking me for money. She wasn't asking me to come home. She was simply talking, the way someone talks after holding their breath for too long inside a sealed room and finally finding a crack of fresh air. Are you okay, Mom? I asked. Another pause. I'm the same, which meant no. You could leave, I said. There are resources. I can help you find somewhere safe. I'm fine, Harper. I just wanted to hear your voice. We spoke for about 8 more minutes. She asked about my life, and I told her I was working in real estate now. She said softly, Your grandmother would be proud of you. Her voice broke for a second. Then she steadied it again, and both of us pretended that moment hadn't happened. After I hung up, I sat on the floor of my apartment for almost 10 minutes, staring at the blank wall across from me. I thought about calling Anthony. I didn't. I thought about calling Dylan. I didn't. I even considered driving straight to 2714 Maplewood Drive, knocking on the front door, and standing there until someone answered, and then saying, "What? What do you say to a man who burned everything you owned and slept peacefully that same night?" Nothing. There was nothing left to say. 3 months later, I was sitting at my desk at Midwest Title Services, scrolling through the weekly foreclosure list from the Franklin County Recorder's Office. It was something I did routinely while searching for potential investment opportunities for Rachel Davenport's clients. Then a familiar address stopped my hand: 2714 Maplewood Drive. Notice of default. Lender: Bank of Columbus, N.A. Scheduled auction date: 60 days. I read the address once, then again, then a third time. Finally, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, breathing slowly through my mouth like someone who had been underwater too long. 2714 Maplewood Drive, 3-bedroom ranch, quarter-acre lot, brass house numbers, lazy boy in the living room, burn barrel in the backyard. A notice of default meant the mortgage payments had been missed for at least 90 consecutive days. The bank had already filed the required paperwork with the county. The next step would be a notice of sale, followed by a courthouse auction open to anyone who showed up with a cashier's check and a pulse. Anthony Collins, the man who built his entire identity around that house, the man who polished those brass numbers every spring and replaced the roof with his own hands, the man who liked to remind me my house means my rules, had borrowed against it until the bank decided it wasn't his anymore. I pulled the complete property record, the $92,000 home equity line of credit from 3 years earlier, the $70,000 cash-out refinance 2 years after that. Total debt secured against a house worth maybe $215,000 on a good day. According to the records, he hadn't made a mortgage payment in 6 months. The bank had followed every legal step: notice of default, opportunity to cure, final notice of sale. And Anthony Collins had done nothing. No payment, no negotiation, no attempt at a short sale. Either he didn't understand what the paperwork meant, or he was too proud to ask anyone for help. Possibly both. I closed the browser tab, then opened it again, closed it once more. I walked to the break room, poured a cup of coffee, and stood by the window. The memory of the fire returned with uncomfortable clarity. The quilt, the smell of lighter fluid, the garden hose he held carefully to protect the grass. My house, my rules. Then I went back to my desk and opened the auction calendar. I told Rachel Davenport before I told anyone else. We sat together in her office, a corner room overlooking a strip mall parking lot. It should have felt depressing, but Rachel had filled the space with ferns and framed photos from past closings. The room felt more like a greenhouse than an office. "I need your advice," I said. "Not as my broker, as someone I trust." She set her reading glasses on the desk. "Go on." "There's a property heading to auction, 3-bedroom ranch, quarter-acre lot. Needs a new roof and some plumbing updates, but the structure is solid. Comparable homes in that neighborhood are selling around $215,000. The auction estimate will probably fall somewhere between $120 and $140. Rachel tilted her head slightly. "That's a decent spread. So what's the catch?" "It's my father's house." She watched me for a long moment. The vent above us stirred the leaves of the fern beside her desk. Then she asked the exact question I needed. "Is this a business decision or a personal one?" "Both." She nodded slowly. "Then answer me this. If this exact property belonged to a complete stranger, at that price and that zip code, would you buy it?" I had already done the math. Estimated auction purchase, about $148,000. Closing costs and title fees, roughly $4,000. Repairs, roof, water heater, updated plumbing, maybe $24,000. Total investment around $176,000. Market value after repairs, $215,000 or slightly more. Built-in equity from the start. "Yes," I said. "I'd buy it." "Then you already know your answer." She paused. "But Harper, make sure you're buying a house, not buying a fight." "I'm buying a house," I said calmly. "If it happens to be the house where my father burned everything I owned, That part isn't my problem. Rachel studied me over the rim of her glasses. Then she nodded once, the slow, deliberate nod she used when a deal made sense. I'll help you get the pre-approval, she said. I hadn't gone looking for this opportunity, but I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't seen it either. For the next 3 weeks, I prepared exactly the way Rachel had taught me, the same way I would evaluate any investment property. If this was going to work, it had to be clean. First, I ran the title search myself. The deed showed only one name: Anthony Collins. My mother, Jessica, was not listed on the title. My father had made that decision 24 years earlier when they bought the house, claiming it would make paperwork simpler. What it actually simplified was control. With the house only in his name, Jessica had no legal authority. She couldn't sell it, refinance it, or stop him from borrowing against it. For 2 decades she had lived there as a guest in her own home. Next, I verified the liens, the original mortgage, the $92,000 HELOC, the $70,000 refinance loan, all secured against the property, all in default. Then I confirmed the auction details. Location at the Franklin County Courthouse, deposit requirement 10% of the opening bid, payable immediately by cashier's check. With Rachel's help, I secured pre-approval for an investment property loan through a local credit union. I combined that with my savings, 4 years of commission checks, late-night gas station shifts, hotel housekeeping wages, every dollar I had earned since climbing out that bedroom window. It was enough. The night before the auction, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the floor of my apartment with a mug of tea and the only photograph I still owned from my old life, a faded Polaroid of my grandmother holding me at a church picnic when I was 5. I was laughing in the picture. She was looking at me like I was the most important thing in the world. I slipped the photo back into my wallet and set my alarm for 6 a.m. The next morning, I would stand on the steps of the Franklin County Courthouse and bid on the house where my father once told me I was nothing. The cashier's check in my bag was for $13,100, 10% of the expected bid. 6 years of work, 6 years of silence, 6 years of becoming someone Anthony Collins had never imagined I could be. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and old paper. The auction took place in a room on the 2nd floor. Linoleum floors, folding chairs, a podium at the front. Around 20 people sat scattered through the room, mostly investors and attorneys waiting for their next property to cross the block. I was the only woman in the room under 30. The auctioneer moved quickly through the list of properties. A duplex on Wayne Avenue, a vacant lot near Riverside, an aging apartment building on Salem tied up in a tax lien dispute. Each one introduced in formal legal language and then settled within a minute through quiet bids and raised paddles. Then the auctioneer called the next property. Lot 7, 2714 Maplewood Drive. Single-family residence. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms. Quarter-acre lot. Foreclosure sale. Opening bid, set by the lien holder at $119,000. My chest tightened. I kept my paddle pressed flat against my thigh. 2 bidders raised immediately. One was a man in a golf shirt who looked like he bought houses the same way some people buy lottery tickets. The other was a woman holding a clipboard who clearly represented a regional investment firm. 119. 120. The numbers climbed steadily. The man in the golf shirt dropped out at 128. The woman with the clipboard pushed it to 130. I raised my paddle. 131. She looked at me. Then she looked down at the spreadsheet on her clipboard. After a moment, she shook her head and lowered her paddle. The auctioneer scanned the room. No movement. Silence hung in the air like a held breath. Sold. $131,000. Bidder number 7. I walked to the clerk's table and signed the paperwork. The pen they handed me was a cheap blue ballpoint, the kind courthouses buy in bulk for a few cents each. But when I wrote HarperCollins on the purchase agreement, my hand didn't shake. The clerk glanced down at the name. Then she looked at the foreclosure documents. Collins. She looked back at me. I met her eyes. She stamped the paperwork without saying a word. My father had allowed every opportunity to save that house to pass him by. Every cure period, every negotiation window, every chance to sell before the bank took control. He was too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to admit the garage had failed, too certain that 2714 Maplewood Drive would always belong to him simply because he believed it should. But beliefs don't cancel default notices, and foreclosure doesn't care about pride. The deed was officially recorded 17 days later at the Franklin County Recorder's Office. I picked up the certified copy on a Tuesday afternoon and sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot, holding the document in both hands. Deed of conveyance. Grantee, Harper Collins, my name, my house. That Saturday, I drove to Maplewood Drive for the first time in 6 years. The neighborhood looked almost exactly the same: neatly trimmed lawns, mailboxes with American flag decals, pickup trucks in driveways. But everything felt smaller somehow. Childhood places always shrink when you return as an adult carrying different memories. I parked across the street from 2714. The brass house numbers had dulled with age. My father hadn't polished them in a while. The patio he once poured himself had developed a long crack running across the concrete. The lawn, however, was perfectly trimmed. Of course it was. My father would let the roof collapse before he allowed the grass to grow past 2 inches. And there he was, standing in the yard pushing a mower in straight lines, wearing the same flannel shirt he had worn the day he burned my belongings. He didn't notice me. I stepped out of the car and stood on the sidewalk facing the house. His house, my house. A woman walking her dog passed by, and I asked if she would take a photo for me. She smiled and agreed. In the photograph, I'm standing calmly in front of the house, the brass numbers 2714 visible just over my shoulder. I'm not smiling. I'm not angry. I'm simply there. Later, I printed the photo at a CVS. On the back, I wrote in neat block letters: New owner, deed recorded, Franklin County Recorder's Office, H. Collins. I slid the photograph into a white envelope. No name on the outside, just like the envelope my mother once gave me. I drove back to Maplewood Drive one more time. I opened the mailbox at the curb, placed the envelope inside, raised the red flag, and drove away. Then I waited a day. I wanted him to open the mailbox first, to hold the photo, to read the message, to feel the ground shift beneath him before he heard my voice. Sunday afternoon, 4:17 p.m. I sat at my kitchen table with my phone in front of me. After a moment, I picked it up and dialed the number I had never deleted. It rang once. Only once. Harper. His voice sounded different, older, rougher around the edges. But there was something else in it too, something I hadn't expected. He sounded like a man who had been waiting for that call but would never admit it. Like someone who had kept his daughter's number saved in his phone for 6 years without dialing it, because dialing would mean admitting the silence had been his fault. And admitting fault was the one thing Anthony Collins had never been able to do. Check your mailbox, I said. Then I hung up. I set the phone back on the table and stared at it for a long time. My heart was pounding, but not from anger or triumph. It felt more like completing a circuit that had been open for 6 years. He had answered on the first ring. He could have let it go to voicemail. He could have waited longer, 3 rings, 4, 5, long enough to pretend he wasn't eager, long enough to reconstruct the version of himself who didn't need anyone. But he hadn't. He had answered the phone the way someone reaches for something they're afraid might vanish. I didn't know what he would do next. Maybe he would explode in anger. Maybe he would cry. Maybe he would drive straight to my office. Or maybe he would sit on the porch in silence. But one thing I knew with absolute certainty. For the first time in his life, Anthony Collins was about to open a piece of mail and learn that his daughter owned the roof over his head. I wasn't there when he opened it. What happened next I learned later from Eleanor Price, who had been sitting on her porch with a glass of iced tea and a perfect view of the mailbox across the street. Eleanor was 74 years old, and she had fully earned the right to observe her neighborhood without apologizing for it. She told me my father walked down to the curb about 20 minutes after my call. He still had his flip phone in his hand. He opened the mailbox, pulled out the white envelope, and turned it over slowly. No name, no return address. He tore it open right there in the driveway. He looked at the photograph. Eleanor said he froze. The kind of stillness that happens when the body understands something before the mind does. He stared at the front of the photo for a long moment. Then he flipped it over and read the message on the back. Eleanor said his arm dropped to his side. The envelope slipped from his hand and drifted onto the pavement. Then he walked to the front porch steps and sat down. The same steps where he used to sit with a beer in the evenings, surveying what he always called his property. And he stayed there, for 40 minutes. He didn't call Jessica, he didn't shout, he didn't even go inside. He just sat there holding the photograph in one hand and his phone in the other, staring across the lawn he had carefully mowed that morning. The lawn that now belonged to his 23-year-old daughter. Eleanor later told me he tried to call me 3 times. I didn't answer. He sat there like a man who had just learned his own house no longer recognized him. Later that evening, Eleanor called me. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked in that steady voice of hers. I actually thought about the question. Really thought about it. "Yeah," I said finally. "I think I am." For 6 years my father had controlled every conversation, who spoke and who stayed quiet. Now the silence belonged to him, and I was the one choosing not to break it. 2 days later, Anthony Collins walked into the office of Davenport Realty Group at 10:15 on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my desk finishing my second cup of coffee and reviewing a listing agreement for a property on Huffman Avenue. Rachel's office door was open. 2 other agents, Travis Monroe and Olivia Grant, were working at their desks. A young couple waited in the lobby, flipping through a binder of available homes. The front door opened. My father stepped inside like a man entering a courtroom. Flannel shirt, work jeans with a grease stain on one knee. A baseball cap that still read Collins Family Auto Works, even though the business had closed 3 months earlier. He looked older. The lines around his eyes were deeper. His face had grown thinner, but his posture hadn't changed. Rigid, authoritative, the posture of a man who believed rooms were supposed to rearrange themselves around him. His eyes scanned the office until they landed on me. "Harper." I looked up from my desk. My nameplate faced him clearly. Harper Collins, licensed agent. "Anthony," I said. "Not Dad. Not anymore." He crossed the room in 4 long strides. "You think this is funny?" he demanded. "You think you can take my house?" I set my pen down carefully. "It stopped being your house when you stopped paying the mortgage 6 months ago," I said calmly. "The bank filed for foreclosure. The auction was public. Anyone with financing could bid. I had financing. I bid. I won. Everything is recorded at the county office." "That is my house." His voice rose sharply. Travis and Olivia both stopped typing. The couple in the waiting area looked up. "I built that patio," he continued. "I put that roof on with my own hands." "And then you borrowed against it until there was nothing left," I replied evenly. "You took out a $92,000 home equity loan for Dylan's shop. Then you refinanced for another $70,000. The business failed. The payments stopped. The bank followed the law." I held his gaze. "This didn't happen because of me, Anthony. It happened because of decisions you made." He stood there breathing hard, fists clenched at his sides. The entire office had gone quiet in the way rooms do when everyone is pretending not to stare. Rachel stepped out of her office. She moved with the calm confidence of someone who had closed hundreds of deals and understood exactly how to control a room without raising her voice. "Sir," she said evenly, "I'm going to need you to lower your voice. This is a place of business." My father turned toward her. "You don't know this girl," he snapped. "She called Child Protective Services on her own father when she was 14 years old. That's the kind of person you hired." Rachel didn't react. She simply looked at me, and I looked back at her. "I reported it to my school counselor," I said calmly. "You screamed in my face across the dinner table. The counselor contacted Child Protective Services because that's what they are required to do. They came, they investigated, and nothing happened to you legally. But you spent the next 3 years telling every relative we had that I'd called the authorities on my own father. You used it to isolate me. So if we're going to talk about it, Anthony, let's talk about what actually happened. The couple in the waiting area was openly staring now. Olivia Grant's hand hovered motionless over her keyboard. Travis Monroe had quietly taken out his phone, not recording anything, just holding it like a reflex. My father's face turned red. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I raised you," he said finally. His voice had lowered, but the sharpness was still there. "I fed you. I gave you a roof over your head. And this is how you repay me?" "You burned everything I owned in the backyard," I replied. "My clothes, my books, my sketchbooks, my grandmother's quilt. You stood there holding a garden hose so the grass wouldn't catch fire, while 17 years of my life turned to ash. And afterward, you told the entire family I was ungrateful." I paused. Every person in that office was listening. You don't get to destroy someone else's property and then complain when you lose your own, because of the choices you made. My father stared at me. I could almost see the calculations moving behind his eyes, searching for some angle, some word that could pull the situation back into a world he controlled. But there was no angle. There was no leverage. The deed had been recorded. The auction was legal. The numbers were public. "You have 30 days, I said. "That's the standard eviction timeline under Ohio law. I'm not shortening it, and I'm not extending it. 30 days. He stood in the middle of the office surrounded by people who now knew exactly who he was. And for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. He turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Standing there watching him leave, I realized something I hadn't expected. He still didn't understand. In his mind, the house had always been about power, his power. It never occurred to him that I hadn't bought the house to take something from him. I bought it because I could. 6 years earlier, I couldn't even afford a bus ticket. Now I could buy a house. It just happened to be his. But sometimes I still ask myself a question. Is there really a difference between justice and revenge when the person on the other side can't see the line? Does the label matter, or does it only matter what it costs you to cross it? I'd love to hear what you think about that. Dylan called me 4 days later. It was the first time I had heard his voice since I was 17. Harper. He sounded like a man standing in a burning room who had just realized the exit door might be locked. "I know we haven't talked in a long time," he began awkwardly. "But Dad needs somewhere to go. He said you gave him 30 days. "That's right." "Okay, well, here's the thing." He paused long enough that I could hear him swallow. "Kelly and I are in a 1-bedroom apartment in Columbus. It's already tight. I can't really take him in." "Dylan," I said slowly, "he mortgaged the house for your shop. $92,000. Then he refinanced for another $70,000 trying to keep the business alive. You know that, right?" Silence. "He put everything into that garage," I continued. "The house, his credit, his retirement. Everything went into Collins Family Auto Works. And when the shop collapsed, you moved to Columbus." "That's not fair. I never asked him to—" "Did you pay him back?" More silence. The answer was in the silence. "Harper, I'm not the bad guy here." "I didn't say you were," I replied. "But I'm not the solution either. You had 22 years of his support. I had 17 years of his control. He gave you a business. He gave me a burn barrel. And now you're calling the daughter he threw out to clean up the mess the son he invested in couldn't hold together?" His breathing sounded uneven. "I'm not selling the house," I said firmly, "and I'm not letting him stay there without paying rent. That isn't my responsibility. If you want to help your father, then help him. But you don't get to hand that job to me." I hung up. Then I sat there thinking about the old sign, Collins Family Auto Works, and how the entire family's money and belief had once been poured into those words. And when the sign went dark, the son simply kept driving. My father bet everything on his son. His son left him on read. Anthony Collins moved out on day 27. No call, no message, no forwarding address. Later, Eleanor Price told me she watched him loading a borrowed pickup truck with cardboard boxes, a duffel bag, and the lazy boy recliner from the living room. He drove away toward a cousin's place on the other side of Columbus. The throne went with him. The kingdom didn't. I waited a week before returning to 2714 Maplewood Drive. I brought a locksmith, a contractor, and a heavy mix of emotions I hadn't fully sorted out yet. The house felt dimmer than I remembered. My father had left it in rough condition. The carpet was stained. The kitchen faucet dripped steadily. The living room smelled faintly of beer and old newspapers, but the structure itself was solid. The walls were straight. The foundation held firm, even if the man living above it had not. I walked through the house with the contractor making notes. New roof, replace the water heater, update the plumbing in the bathroom, fresh paint. It was a project, not a miracle. Exactly the kind of house Rachel had taught me to see differently, the kind where value hides beneath neglect. Then I reached the back bedroom, my old room, the one my father had turned into Dylan's home gym. The weight bench was gone, the standing mirror was gone, but inside the closet, on a high shelf my father probably assumed was empty, something remained. A crushed Nike shoebox. I lifted the lid. Inside were 3 torn pages from a sketchbook, their edges blackened and curled. One was a charcoal drawing of my grandmother's hands that I had sketched from memory when I was 16. Beneath it were 2 more drawings, partially burned. At the bottom of the box was a small square of fabric, patchwork cotton. The edges were singed. The faint smell of lavender still clung to it, a single square from the quilt. My father had gone back to the ashes. After the fire died down, after I had gone upstairs, after the neighborhood lights went out, he must have reached into the burn barrel and pulled these pieces out. He had kept them in a shoebox on a closet shelf for 6 years. He never told me. He never used them as an apology. He simply kept them the way he had kept my phone number all those years, quietly, privately, pointlessly. I sat on the floor of my old bedroom holding that small square of fabric and felt something I didn't have a name for. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't anger either. It was something in between, like discovering a handprint pressed into wet cement by someone who once broke your window. It didn't erase the damage, but it changed the way you remembered the moment. For the first time I understood that my father wasn't only a man who knew how to destroy. He was also a man who knew how to regret, but who carried that regret in the worst possible way, silently, stubbornly, and too late. 3 days after I changed the locks, Jessica called me. I noticed the difference in her voice immediately. 6 months earlier it had sounded tight, stretched thin like a wire under too much tension. Now it felt clearer, still careful, still soft, but present in a way it hadn't been for years. "He's staying at Victor's," she said. Victor Collins was my father's cousin. A small house on the west side with a pull-out couch and a family tradition of not asking too many questions. He took the recliner and 3 boxes, that's all. "And you?" I asked. "I'm still at the house." She hesitated. "Your house." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. "Harper, do you want me to leave?" I leaned back against my kitchen counter and closed my eyes. I saw her again the way she had looked 6 years earlier in the dark hallway, sliding that envelope into my hand. $500, my birth certificate, my social security card. The entire quiet savings of a woman who had spent 24 years under a roof she didn't legally own, married to a man who believed silence meant agreement and obedience meant love. "Do you want to stay?" I asked. She began to cry. Not the quiet, one hand over the mouth crying she had learned in my father's house. Real crying, the kind that takes up space. "Yes," she said. "Please." "Then stay," I told her. $200 a month. Enough to cover utilities and keep things fair. "I'm not giving you charity, Mom. I'm giving you a lease." "200?" she repeated softly. "The roof is getting replaced next month," I said. "The plumber's coming Thursday. And Mom," I paused. "His name isn't on anything anymore. Not the deed, not the mailbox, not the rules." She cried again, but this time it sounded different. It was the sound a person makes when something heavy lifts off their shoulders and their body doesn't quite know what to do with the sudden lightness. "I should have done more back then," she whispered. "I know that." "You gave me the envelope," I said. That was enough to begin. That night, for the first time in 24 years, Jessica Collins slept in a house where the front door wasn't controlled by someone else. The person who owned the deadbolt now was her daughter, and her daughter believed doors should open from the inside. Over the next 4 weekends, I worked on 2714 Maplewood Drive with a toolbox, a contractor named Eddie, and a stubborn determination I apparently inherited from the one person I never wanted to resemble. We tore off the old shingles and replaced them with new ones, charcoal gray instead of my father's faded brown. I stood in the paint aisle at Lowe's for nearly 20 minutes, choosing a new exterior color before settling on soft white walls with slate blue trim. When we finished, the house looked completely different from the street, which was exactly the point. The brass house numbers stayed. I polished them. They deserved better than neglect. Inside, my mother and I pulled up the old stained carpet and discovered hardwood floors underneath that my father had covered years ago because he didn't like the sound of footsteps. We sanded and sealed them, and the house filled with the smell of polyurethane and fresh beginnings. Two scents that aren't technically the same but often arrive together. The back bedroom, the gym, the closet, the room that had once been mine, became a bedroom again. Fresh paint, new curtains, and on the wall, inside a simple oak frame behind glass, I hung the square of quilt fabric I had found in the shoebox. Burned edges, faded lavender scent, preserved. One Sunday, Eleanor Price came over carrying marigold seedlings and 2 bags of potting soil. Together we knelt in the backyard where the burn barrel had once stood and planted flowers, bright orange marigolds, the kind that return every year whether anyone asks them to or not. "He burned things in this yard," I said. Eleanor pressed soil around a small plant and smiled. "And you planted things." My father called in October, 5 months after the auction. 1 month after the marigolds bloomed. I was sitting on the front porch, my front porch, drinking coffee and watching the quiet early evening settle over the neighborhood. The trees along Maplewood Drive had started turning color. Eleanor waved from her yard. Inside the house, my mother was watching television at whatever volume she wanted. My phone buzzed. Anthony Collins. I watched the screen for 3 rings, then I answered. "Harper." His voice sounded rough, like gravel dragged across pavement. "Anthony." There was a long pause. I could hear a dog barking somewhere a few houses away. "You were always stubborn," he said eventually. "I was always determined," I replied. "You called it stubborn because it didn't benefit you." Another long silence. I could hear him breathing heavily, the slow breath of a 56-year-old man whose pride had cost him almost everything. "How's your mother?" he asked. It was the first time he had ever asked about her that way. Not my wife, not her, your mother. "She's doing well," I said. "She's at Maplewood. She's safe." He didn't answer, and I'm not sure he knew how. "Anthony," I said, "I'm not going to pretend what happened was acceptable. The fire, the isolation, the way you erased me from the family, none of that disappears just because time has passed." I paused. "But I'm not going to punish you forever either. I won't make things easy. But I'm not going to seal the door." "So what is this supposed to be?" he asked. "This is a conversation," I said. "That's all it is right now." He stayed silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Okay." And the line went dead. I set my phone down on the porch railing and picked up my coffee. The sky above Maplewood Drive had turned amber as evening settled over the neighborhood. Inside the house, Jessica laughed at something on the television, a sound I realized I had almost never heard from her before. The windows glowed warmly behind me, and that warmth had nothing to do with the thermostat. My father lost this house the same way he lost me, by believing we could never leave. I'm sitting on this porch again as I tell you this story. This time it's early morning, before the neighborhood wakes. My coffee is in a chipped mug I bought at a thrift store, decorated with a faded floral pattern that reminds me of the fabric pieces in my grandmother's quilt. The lawn belongs to me now. The roof belongs to me. And the brass numbers that read 2714 catch the first light of sunrise. I keep them polished. Some things deserve care even if the person who installed them never learned how to give it. I didn't buy this house out of revenge. I bought it because it was a sound investment. Because I had the knowledge, the savings, and the license to make that decision. And because 6 years earlier I had been a 17-year-old girl standing in this same yard with nothing, watching everything I owned turn into smoke. That night I made a promise to myself. Silently, with no witnesses, I promised that one day I would build something from those ashes. I just never imagined it would become this literal. And somewhere along the way, I realized the promise I made that night wasn't really about the house. It was about refusing to let someone else decide the size of my future. For a long time, I believed survival meant proving my father wrong. I thought success would feel like victory. But standing here now, watching the sunrise over this yard, I understand something different. This story was never about winning against him. It was about learning how to stand on my own ground. So if you're in the first year after everything collapsed, when it feels like the world burned down around you, hear this. That moment does not define the rest of your life. If you're working 2 jobs, studying at night, and wondering if any of it matters, it does. If someone told you that your dreams are unrealistic, selfish, or disrespectful, that says more about their limits than yours. And if you feel like you're standing alone, remember this. Rebuilding never happens all at once. It happens in small decisions repeated every single day. Anyone can destroy something. That takes minutes. But building something better takes patience, discipline, and courage. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is quietly keep going until one morning you wake up and realize the life you built is stronger than the one someone tried to take away from you. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to let me know you were here. Tap the like button so more people who need this message can find it. And if you've ever had to rebuild your life after someone tried to tear it down, share your story in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read every single comment, and your words often remind someone else that they're not alone. If you know someone who is going through their own starting over moment, please share this video with them. Sometimes the right story at the right time can give someone the strength to keep going one more day. And if you want to hear more stories about people who lost everything and still found a way to stand back up, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I'll see you in the next story.